Hello, everybody. Welcome to our virtual bird club meeting here live from the internet. I've not decided whether this is, a virtual library meeting room or the virtual nature center or a virtual church basement. But it's a great place to talk to everybody about birds and birding, and I'm certainly grateful to be able to do so. Hello, everybody that is coming in. Before we get going on to the main event, which I am extremely excited about, I do want to talk about something that I think that you should be aware of, and I would be sort of derelict in my duty as a host of this club if I didn't take this opportunity to comment on some recent events. Certainly a lot has happened in the 2 weeks since our last meeting, certainly surrounding our national conversation about systemic racism and particularly how systemic racism impacts the birding and nature communities. And I'm speaking, of course, about Christian Cooper in Central Park and then the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which, of course, could have been Christian, one of our own. And I don't say that to minimize the pain of George Floyd and his family and of Minneapolis, but to amplify the fact that we all have some work to do with our own reckoning of the impacts of racism on something even as innocuous as birding. Birding while black is different. And the birding and nature community needs to come together so that this hobby, this avocation, this lifestyle that we love is available to everybody. But my voice is not the one you need to hear on this. I'm only saying that because I'm here now in front of y'all. And those of us in the overwhelmingly white birding community need to say it and hear it said. But the people you should be listening to are over on Twitter and on Instagram. There's a bunch of black birders and other naturalists that are banding together for Black Birders Week. And you should all check that out. Hashtag Black Birders Week. There's so much positive energy over there. It is sort of overwhelming in all the good ways and frequently difficult and uncomfortable ways too. But that's kind of how it should be. So tomorrow, some of the leaders, and I'm gonna put this up real quick. Tomorrow, some of the leaders are going to be hosting a live stream, Birding While Black. There are two of them, two live streams tomorrow. So it promises to be really great, and you can show your support for all these amazing black birders by participating and going to Twitter or Instagram and following, supporting, listening, using your voice in the birding community to amplify theirs. So please look for that. There's a lot of people that you probably know if you are active at all online. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving me the time to say that, but now I have the distinct pleasure to welcome to the internet the youngest birder ever to break 700 species in a year, the author of Falcon Freeway, about that year, and of course Alaska birding partisan Christian Hagenlocher. Christian, how are you this evening?
I'm doing great, Nate. Thanks so much for having me on tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's great to have you here. I thought this was a really wonderful time to do this talk because right about now is when you would be going to Attu. Is that right?
Yeah, maybe not me personally.
Maybe not you, but yeah,
definitely
this is the time.
This is the week to be there. And in fact, this is the week usually we'd be coming home. So
yeah,
migration has been happening, and the weather conditions this year have been especially brutal out there to bring many new first North American records that nobody's going to be there to see. So it hurts for all of us.
It's so funny because there are still, local birders on St. Paul and on Gamble. So there are people out there looking for those places, even though they can't cover it like the tour groups do with so many people on there for so long. But there's no one on Attu.
Exactly. But the birds definitely are there. So we can only hope and dream about what's there and hope that next year the tour resumes and all the pieces fall into place so birders can be covering as much of Attu as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are you going to talk to us about tonight?
Well, tonight I'm going to take you on a virtual field trip to Attu. So this is a new thing for me, a new type of presentation that integrates some video that I've shot on Attu and some photographs. And really, it's just going to be an adventure. I'm going to explain some of the history of Attu, a little bit of the birding history, and share with you guys what it looks like, maybe dispel some big ear myths of what the movie portrays Attu versus what's actually there. So it'll be a fun time for sure.
All right. So I think so. Just to say to all the people listening, we are trying something slightly different with this week's program. We're going to use Zoom because Christian has a ton of video footage that he couldn't send over to me, and bear with us while we try and make the make the transition to a different audio visual system. But I think we worked out the kinks today, Christian. I have high hopes. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to you. You can go ahead and share your screen, and we'll do it. Let's do it.
All right, sounds good. We're going to work through a little bit of the technical difficulties here. Do you still see me? Okay, sounds good. So for some reason, my screen sharing went away. So let me pull that up.
I see your screen, Christian, and your screen is broadcasting. So you're good. Awesome. There you go. All right, awesome. I'll cut myself out.
All right. Awesome. Well, before I launch into this virtual field trip tonight, I just wanted to offer a brief footnote at the beginning of my talk, just by sharing that my experience on Attu is relatively limited. I've only visited the island twice. I know that's more than some birders, but it's also less than other birders. So I'm just speaking from a very limited experience, having only visited Attu a handful of times. And there's many more knowledgeable birders out there and history buffs that know all the details. So I'm going to try and do my best to get it right tonight. I have some things written down to help me, but if I get anything wrong or make any mistakes or leave any unanswered questions, please stick around at the end for the Q&A. I'll be sure to leave time because I want to engage with you guys and be sure that your questions are answered. And if I don't know the answer, we'll be sure to follow up with you and figure that out. So without any further ado, let's go birding together on Attu. So I'm going to try and narrate this versus just be a talking head the whole time. So there will be some times that I just let you watch and see what I'm seeing. And then there will be some times that you're able to hear what I'm explaining or interpret. So Zuganrua Bird Tours is currently the only birding tour group that takes people to Attu. And so this is just a brief plug for John Pushak from Zuganrua Bird Tours. Great website, great tour. If you'd like to figure out how you can go to Attu, right now this is the only option. So there's lots of great info online to figure out how to get a hold of him. Both John Pushak and Neil Hayward, veteran big ear birder, were my guides, and our trip started together in Anchorage, Alaska. So if you want to travel to Attu, you have to fly to Anchorage from the lower 48, and then fly from Anchorage to Adak. Gone are the days that you used to fly directly to Attu by the Revolution Airways. That service has been suspended, and that airline no longer exists. So in order to get to Attu, you'll have to fly Alaska Airlines first, and leave Anchorage International Airport and fly down to the Aleutian Islands to the island of Adak. Once you land on Adak, you'll be able to transfer to a boat and then take the boat the remaining way out to Attu. So flying to Adak is a real adventure in and of itself. You're flying over the volcanic Aleutian Island chain. So through the clouds on a clear day, you're able to see the tops of these volcanoes. Some of them are actually still erupting or billowing smoke or steam. So it's super neat to be able to look down and actually see active volcanoes. As soon as you break through the clouds and look down at the shores of Adak on the initial approach, you're able to see some of the topography that makes the Aleutian Islands unique. You can see it's kind of a mixture of rocky coastline, barren, crumpled landscape that's devoid of trees, and these these kind of tall, towering peaks of snow-covered mountains. So as you fly in, a birder can't help but wonder what might be laying below on some of these crystal clear ponds, rivers, and wetlands. In fact, in 2016, when I flew in, I looked down and out of the window of the plane on our final approach, I saw 2 smew that flushed off of a pond in Adak and flew away. That was the last the birders saw of them, but they had been on the island for the week before. Adak is called the birthplace of the winds, mostly because of the convergence of the cold air coming off of the north, or the warm air coming up from the Pacific Ocean and the cold air coming down from the Bering Sea. And the town of Adak is like birding the zombie apocalypse. It used to be a naval air station, and then once the Navy left and all of the residents moved out, the wind has literally ruined all of these unoccupied homes. So the glass is shattered. Very few people live there year-round anymore. It's kind of a fishing hub for some commercial fishing. And before the Attu trip embarks, birders wander around looking for birds. Although Adak isn't quite as good as Attu, you still get this nice diversity of Aleutian birds and some birds that overshoot and come over from the Russian Far East, like this ruff. It's also an area that gets just as many common snipe as it does Wilson snipe. And so you can see those birds displaying over Contractor's Marsh, as well as the Eurasian subspecies of green-winged teal, and many bald eagles. This is probably the last stronghold of bald eagles on the Aleutian Islands. The further west you go, the greater your chances of seeing a rare species of eagle. Adak also has leftover ordnance, unexploded ordnance from World War II. And so there's a high risk to venturing alone into some of the areas on the island. But a lot of the island is walkable and has been cleared of ordnance for birders, as well as big game hunters that hunt the caribou. There's a variety of wading birds, shorebirds, ptarmigan, just some amazing birds on Adak that before you go to Attu, you're sure to see some great birds and add new birds to your life list. After the boat has been refueled from its journey to Adak and resupplied, the birders load up and it's time to get going. We take the MV Pukuk, 79-foot boat, out into the Bering Sea. Before we finish, we have a safety briefing where we get instructed on what to do if the boat were to go down. And part of the fun of that is learning how to put on the emergency survival suits. And so it's fun to learn how to do that. And you're on a vessel, so it's a pretty long boat trip out to Attu from Adak. So the boat trip is about, let's see, between 60 and 72 hours, which can take longer depending on weather and the tidal conditions. The ocean is usually temperamental, so sometimes it can be calm and nice, and then other days can be a lot rougher. Usually birders that don't fare too well on the open ocean spend the first few days in the cabin. Those who are lucky enough to be wearing a catch or not get seasick and go birding from the back of the boat or from the wheelhouse. It's a multi-day pelagic, so you're on the open ocean for up to 2.5 days. So there's lots of northern fulmars, both light phase, dark phase, and everything in between. There's some other really neat birds, such as albatross. The most common albatross is the Laysan albatross, and it's not uncommon to see a couple dozen in one day from the boat. It's awesome just to see them gliding right next to the boat. The short-tailed albatross is also less frequently encountered, but they leave their nesting grounds off the coast of Japan and live on the Pacific Ocean. So it's definitely high probability that you'll see short-tailed albatross on this trip. After leaving Adak, you'll pass some of these other islands, Kamchitka, Kiska, Semisopolchnoi, Garoloi, all of these volcanic Aleutian islands as you make your way towards Attu. On the days when the ocean was rougher, I would spend some time inside reading, and I found a really neat book that I was able to learn a lot about Attu before I visited. It was actually published by the ABA, and Charles Odgood, I believe, was the author, and it's called Attu, Birding on the Edge. So some of the images come from this book during the presentation, like these maps. So it gave me a good sense for the birding history of Attu, who went there, how Attuers got started by Larry Balch. the progress through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s of birding trips in Attu. Gave me an idea of some of the rare birds, such as the spoon-billed sandpiper that was seen in Attu in 1986, I believe. And then I also was able to familiarize myself with some of the common birds that show up every year in Attu. Now, a common bird on Attu is going to be really rare in the lower 48. So olive-back pipit or little stint, which might show up once or twice on the coast of California or Washington, might be annual in Attu. I also looked at some of the maps, and I'll give you guys a few more seconds to look at this map. But this book has some really awesome maps of Attu that combine the World War II history, the birding history, and just kind of a good layout of what the island looks like. You can see on this map, most notably, there's in the Temnak River Basin, there's the white-tailed eagle nest, kind of a cool addition on this map to see historically where white-tailed eagles nested, as well as a whooper swan nest at the edge of Sarana Bay, kind of on the 2 to 3 o'clock spot on this map. So you can see a lot of the trails, the roads, passes, mountains, ridges, and a lot of the cool names on this map. The Russians discovered, or the Russians encountered Attu before European settlers. And so they encountered native people that lived on the islands, the Aleuts. And so a lot of these names like Massacre Bay come from that first Russian encounter where they clashed with the native Aleuts. And a lot of the names on the map come from that early history of Attu. We'll spend a few more seconds looking at this map before it goes to the next slide. However, birders focus their efforts mostly on a smaller area of the island around Casco Cove and some of the other birding areas close by. I'll get back to that in a second. We talked a little bit about the native history. The Aleuts have been on the island for the last 8,000 years. So the Alaska Native people have lived there and usually lived a pretty peaceful life. That is until Russian fur traders came and then the Japanese invaded Attu. But the Aleuts were just a wonderful people. They collected grass and wove some of the finest basketry in the world. The Attu baskets are prized by museums and private collectors. And then the natives were displaced by the Japanese troops when they invaded Attu as a strategic move to try and take over Alaska. And then the general expected to be able to move into the Western United States, but that never happened. So 550 Americans lost their lives and several thousand Japanese lost their lives on the Battle of Attu. There's a couple historical plaques that have been erected by the Fish and Wildlife Service that are on the island. I photographed them here, and they provide more information about the history of Attu. But you don't have to look far when you're on the island to recognize the fact that this was once an active battlefield. You can see machinery and debris that has just been bulldozed into the ocean. And while birding on the island, it's pretty easy to step and fall into a foxhole or a trench. You can see here's a foxhole that I found that wasn't made by a fox. This was made by Japanese soldiers, and it was dug into the ground and covered up with wooden boards. You can see the wooden boards that if I'd stepped on top of those, I would have fallen through. There's also trenches around the island, both dug by American and Japanese troops. You can hear me sloshing around as I'm walking through these trenches. You can also hear some cackling geese in the background. But the memories from World War II are still all over the place. There's unexploded ordnance from howitzer guns. You can see the machine gun tripod on the left. There's old buildings and hangars. But most notably, there's a monument that was erected by the Japanese and the Americans. I think the Japanese built it, but it was a cooperative agreement to build this monument to preserve peace. And so the monument reads, "In memory of all those who sacrificed their lives in the islands and seas of the North Pacific during World War II and in dedication to world peace." And it's written in Japanese and English. So the history of Attu is just fascinating. And some of the people who were there were definitely history buffs. It wasn't just bird watchers that came on the trip, but people go for a variety of reasons. So it's neat to be able to talk to the other folks on the boat and learn about some of the other folks who have come to Attu. There was one woman who came and scattered, I believe, the ashes of her grandfather who fought on Attu. So there's some really deep personal connections to the island for sure. Now I'm going to stop us right here because understanding why birds come to Attu is a big part of bird watching there. And so just like we have migration in the spring and the fall here on our North American continent, Attu is literally at the edge of the North American continent. So the international date line actually wraps around Attu to include Attu as part of North America. But longitudinally speaking, it's actually in the Eastern Hemisphere. And so you get a lot of Siberian birds that migrate from Siberia down into China, India, and Africa to breed, and then they return and fly back up in the springtime to breed along the northern coast and eastern coast of Siberia. If you get any storms over the ocean along the coast of Japan that are blowing to the east, these easterly winds blow the birds off course and they end up kind of getting sucked out to sea. And then the winds will ground the birds either into the ocean if they're not fit enough to fly through the storms, or on whatever the closest piece of land is that they can find. So a lot of these Siberian birds on migration get blown off course by bad weather and end up on Attu. These include, this is an eye-browed thrush, which looks sort of like our American robin. And not all the birds make it and survive. I'll mention that in a second. But you can see this is the bird board from, let's see, the date is covered up, 1998, after the first 2 weeks of Attur, of birders covering the Casco Bay and kind of southeast side of Attu Island. And you can see all of these different names. This is just 2 weeks of birding. And that was a very good year where there were some storms blowing over from Asia, and a lot of the birds got blown over and found on Attu. So that was a record-breaking year depicted in the movie The Big Year, 1998. So there are several really good birds. Not all the birds make it though, and unfortunately last spring in Attu we found this short-eared owl. This is the Siberian race, or the Asiatic race, that had actually expired before we found it, so we couldn't count this individual, but it had perished right after it had arrived on Attu. So unfortunately it wasn't able to find food, and not all birds survive this migration. So some of the birds that have made their way to Attu have been collected by ornithologists or museums that use those records to study the birds and to look at them for the Alaska Museum. So like I mentioned earlier, this is the area that we spent the majority of our time focused on, this area in Casco Cove. The Attur base is historically where birders have lived, both the lower base and the upper base, and then you can see they've biked along this road system that circles Casco Cove and goes out to the point, or to the tip of Casco Point and around Attu National Forest, which consists of 2 coniferous trees that are about 15 feet tall. So there's not a lot of trees on Attu, but that's a good spot to find birds. And then north to the Coast Guard base and the Coast Guard beach, and then around the greater cove. But I'll focus on sharing a little bit with you about the birds that we found in this area, just for the sake of simplifying things and giving you an idea of kind of how we bird the island systematically. So the boat anchors in Casco Cove here in the middle, and then we take a small dinghy to the beach at the beginning of each day, spend all day birding on land, and then get picked up and shuttled back to the boat and spend the night on the boat and eat dinner and breakfast on the boat. So unlike historically where people lived in lower base, people don't live on Attu anymore. After the Coast Guard left the island, they shut it down, and so nobody is a permanent resident on Attu. So we start birding in Casco Cove after taking the Zodiac over and landing on the beach. John Putschock and his tour group brings bicycles, and we can load up the bikes and put them together and ride bikes around to access more parts of the island and see them. Yellow-billed loon was a fun surprise in Casco Cove. And this is the lower base building. Stop that real quick. The lower base building is a nice spot historically, and I'll show you some of the inscriptions that are there from past birders. Even the common birds on Attu can be exciting. So I want you to pay special attention to what the song sparrow looks like and sounds like, because song sparrow is a familiar bird to us all over the ABA area, but the ones on Attu are just a little bit different. So take a look. It's a pretty neat song from the Attu Sonaka subspecies of song sparrow. This is lower base. It's been demolished by wind, so you can see it always has looked bad. This was in 1998, but it looks particularly bad now that the windows have blown out. No one's living there. There's rats inside, but there's also on the walls decades of birders' names and their ABA number, what their life list and their Alaska list are. You can see some of these names might look familiar, like Benton Basham, who I believe was the ABA president for a while. Sandy Comido, who is the birder portrayed by Owen Wilson in the Big Year movie. Some of the birds, great spotted woodpecker. Man, that's an awesome bird. You might recognize some of these most recent names from spring of 2018, 2017. So while we put together the bikes, we birded around lower base, took a look around the bluffs, which are up above the ocean. So you get some of these topographical relief that birds will tuck themselves into ravines or along the streams. And in mid to late May, there's still a lot of snow on Attu. So in 2016, when this picture is from, the snow extends all the way down to the waterline. You can't even see the tops of the mountains, which are often obscured by clouds. But the roads are more like trails, and when we don't have to cross the snow, we're able to bike around a lot further. The spring snowmelt leaves pretty big puddles, so even though you're on a bike, it's important to wear rain gear and rubber boots. Last year we ran into some particularly nice weather. There's about 10 to 12 days of sunshine on Attu per year, and you can see a variety of weather conditions in our virtual field trip today, which come from different days in 2016 and in 2018 from last spring. 2019, I'm sorry. So now we'll bike our way over to some of the freshwater marshes. This is the Peaceful River. See some cackling geese flying across the Peaceful River Valley. Glaucous winged gulls upstream a little ways bathing. So freshwater is important to any migrant bird that is lost and trying to survive. You get a lot of water birds, ducks, geese, swans, shorebirds that find their way to the Peaceful River Valley. This is a common snipe. So Wilson snipe actually would be rare out here, but the common snipe is more abundant. Bluethroat, which breeds on the Seward Peninsula in Alaska, but we were fortunate to find one on Attu. Wood sandpipers, which some days we'd see 12 to 15. They didn't just come in singles, but often in larger groups, as those were returning to their breeding grounds. You can see a distant snowy owl out there. Snowy owls breed on Attu. So it's pretty funny how in the Big Year movie, how Bostic never found a snowy owl till the end of the year when they bred on Attu, which he spent multiple weeks birding on Attu. So he undoubtedly would have run into a snowy owl there. These freshwater puddles that you can see on the tundra are actually trenches and bunkers that have been dug. You can see many of them are rectangular and filled with snowmelt. There's also random things left over from when humans did live on Attu. Obviously, this is from post-World War II, but there's sinks, bathtubs out in the middle of nowhere. A lot of fuel barrels that carried fuel for all the machinery still exist on Attu, and it has disintegrated. The metal has corroded and rusted, releasing a lot of oil into the ecosystem there. The birds, however, don't seem to mind. And I'll mention a lot of work has been done, like oil remediation work, so cleanup crews have gone out to Attu. It's another way if you'd like to go out and see some interesting geese like this taiga bean goose, I think, and the Aleutian subspecies of Canada geese, which are everywhere. You have to be careful walking around Attu so you don't step on their nests. But around the freshwater areas, we run into bramblings, Aleutian terns, breed on Attu, red-throated loons on some of the freshwater marshes and ponds. You hear that low guttural growl. So breeding loons, breeding gulls, breeding geese, tufted ducks pop up from little potholes, fly in front of the mountains. You just never know what you're going to find on Attu. It's really a treasure hunt every day, especially days after bad weather. One of my favorite hikes on Attu is hiking Gilbert Ridge to Alexei Point. You can find gray-tailed tattlers sometimes. And birders usually line up in a long line to cover as much ground as possible. The guides have their spotting scopes. And we walk along the beaches. And oftentimes the shorebirds are the first birds to encounter the beaches. They're tired, they've just been flying over the open ocean, and they need to feed. And so we walk and look along the rocky outcroppings for shorebirds. There's lots of nesting birds like cormorants, both red-faced and pelagic cormorants. We often see spotted seals and breeding gulls along Gilbert Ridge. Sometimes we run into birds that are a little bit more rare, as well as the common birds, like this glaucous-winged gull. The ridge is quite steep, so a lot of the snow up in the mountains melts off and then flows down over the ridge, making these large cascading waterfalls and rivers that need to be either forded or crossed. So old bridges have fallen down, so you need to be creative with how you get around a little bit. Some days it's much easier to walk, especially along Gilbert Ridge. Last spring we spotted this eagle flying overhead along Gilbert Ridge. Hard for my camera to track the focus, but we initially called it a white-tailed eagle, since bald eagles aren't common out on Attu. And then upon closer inspection of our photos, after the bird had flown off, we noticed that that beak was pretty big and yellow, and the tail pattern didn't match white-tailed eagle. Its central tail feathers were longer, and this was a Steller sea eagle, which was a life bird for me and a rare bird anywhere in the AVA area. So we had pie or carrot cake in celebration. Emperor geese are another bird that winter further south in Alaska, but sometimes in the spring the stragglers will be found around Attu. The cackling geese are much more prolific, living in the intertidal zone and then flying inland to nest. During this time of year, Attu really greens up a lot. So even in the 2 weeks from showing up to leaving, it's interesting to see how much foliage erupts and flowers. There's many wildflowers, lots of beautiful grasses, and it's really neat to see the landscape change just in that short time. There's a cackling goose nesting on the beach next to some styrofoam. There's no land predators on Attu, no major mammals, no foxes or anything large that will eat the geese, so they've really made a good comeback. The number Alexi Point, which is at the end of Gilbert Ridge. I can show you a map at the end of the presentation to reorient you with some of these areas that I'm talking about. But Alexi Point is all the way across the bay from Casco Point. So we would take the boat over. Sorry about the volume. We take the boat over, land on the beach, and then walk along the beach and look for shorebirds. And Alexi Point was a really great spot that each day last year we would see new birds every time we would bird it. We'd also see some of the same individuals that stuck around. So we could tell that no new birds had arrived if we were seeing the same counts of birds every day. You can see some debris on the beach from the Marsden mattings, the old runways that were put down so they could land planes on the spongy tundra. It's all birding all the time because you never know when a bird like a Pelagic sandpiper might show up. Really beautiful shorebird with an upcurved bill. It's amazing to have found new birds after the storms had passed and the weather was super nice. Just great light. These birds are feeding pretty close to shore, red-faced cormorant, pelagic cormorant. And so when the weather was great, we'd see fewer rare birds, but the light was really good for photography, so it was a nice trade-off. Common eiders, goose traps on the beach. You can see kind of these black sand beaches from the volcanic Aleutian rock, cooled magma that's thousands of years old, millions of years old, excuse me. So birding the beaches was a good strategy, especially when we didn't get too many big storms. So we'd just get natural migrants that would migrate a little bit further away off their normal flight path and would encounter Attu, would come and land on the beach, feed for a day or two, and then leave. So we're looking at common sandpiper, poorly digiscope with an iPhone and binoculars. But the old world kind of counterpart to our spotted sandpiper. Here's a better photo. See that nice pattern on the back and the unstreaked breast. Long-toed stint, foraging in the kelp flies, and some of the insects. They're at the high tide line. A lot of times you wouldn't see these birds till you're right on top of them. They can blend in pretty well, especially a small bird like a stint. You can hear the rain and the wind. You can see this used to be called Mongolian plover, now it's a lesser sand plover. And a great knot right behind it. Pretty neat. Sometimes a 2-for-1 would just be spectacular. You know, any one of these birds would be great by itself, but to see two rarities so close and to have them be so confiding, to be able to take pictures of them from point blank range almost with a nice telephoto lens was really neat. They just continued feeding and minding their business. Redneck stint, another pretty common Asiatic shorebird, gray-tailed tattler. So birding the beaches was really productive. Oftentimes you think that you might have to bird the interior of the island and all of these hills and stuff, but there were birds just in the rocks along the beach, such as this rocky area hid a female Siberian ruby throat. I think that's what's coming. There you go. So you can see these birds would go where the food was, and there's constantly kelp flies and other invertebrates that were along the beach. My favorite, though, was birding up in the mountains. You can see Attu is a very mountainous island. All those pins mark some of the places that we birded, so you can see we only bird a small area on the whole island. But the island's very steep, very rugged, and it's difficult to get up into the mountains, which are often obscured by clouds and fog. So on the nice days, I tried to take advantage of going up into the mountains. Unfortunately, the mountains are dangerous, and there's people have lost their lives in planes, both in World War II and also in modern times, the C-130 crashed into the side of the mountain on a missed approach to the Coast Guard base. It was interesting to be birding and to come across this wreckage. This photo I took from halfway up the top of Weston Mountain, and this is looking towards the part of the island that we didn't bird. And looking up this valley, this is the Tenmac Valley, where on the map the white-tailed eagle nest is. You can see that half of the valley is still covered by snow here. And so the birders, John Pushok's group that goes out every year, stays in the best areas of the island to find birds, because a lot of the interior of Attu is still covered by ice and snow. So you know there's not going to be a lot of birds foraging in areas that are still underneath the snow. The mountaintops, of course, very steep, covered in snow. So birding in the foothills was really exciting for me because it gave me a chance to break off from the group, spend some time by myself, and get into some new territory in hopes of finding a new bird. We all had radios, so if I did find something new, I was able to radio everybody else and let them know about it. But fortunately, I didn't find too many things the other group had not already seen. I did find this pickaxe left over from World War II, just one of those reminders that you are birding on a battlefield. And this gives you an idea of the angle of some of these mountains. This is the Peaceful River Valley, so I walked up the river up the middle of your screen, and then came up along some of these creeks, and then hiked up into the mountains. There's a subspecies of rock ptarmigan that lives up in the higher elevations that I was looking for. But I was really pleased to flush a pair of lesser sand plovers off of the side of one of these mountains. That the female did a distraction display, and they were very vocal. So I believe they were actually nesting, or at least getting ready to breed, which would be pretty cool. It's a fine line between looking for the nest and walking around on this tundra that the snow just melted off of. It can be pretty slick. I also didn't want to disturb. You can see the birds in the middle of the screen. Here's a female. Didn't want to disturb them and potentially disrupt their beginning breeding cycle. Snowy owls also were frequent, both high in the mountains and nesting rock sandpipers. This is I think the Pribilof subspecies, Kucii. Someone can fact check me on that. But the rock sandpipers would feed down along the beach and then fly up into the interior of the island, up onto the mountainous hillsides to breed. It's a nice young Lapland longspur, one of the most abundant passerines on Attu. A nice adult male. You can see some of the heat haze. It's giving my camera a tough time focusing this high up. Also, snow buntings were really abundant once you get into the rocky tundra. And here's my target species, the Everman's rock ptarmigan. It's almost black. You can hear it. Really cool call. Just a really neat bird. So almost black on the back, which is a nice adaptation to these dark soil volcanic islands. And they would come right out of the mist, so you could almost step on them. They were so camouflaged. And I wouldn't find them until they flushed. So oftentimes the tops of these mountains were above the clouds. So once I hiked up to the top of the mountains, it would open up. The whole other side of the island would be just beautiful. Whereas around where we were birding was under the clouds. It was rainy and foggy. Working your way down from the mountains, you can see what the terrain is like. It's just very rocky, lots of uneven steps, holes filled with water, trenches, creeks to cross. It's just really an adventurous landscape that is a thrill to go birding at. You just don't know what you're going to find. I hope that this is giving you a better idea about what Attu looks like and what birding there can be like. After finishing birding, we get back on the boat, and it's another 40 to 60 hours back. Usually it takes longer. If the tides aren't in your favor, you're going against the current. You can see these swarms of auklets, of alcids that are flying around some of their nesting islands like little deer. This is a combination of crested auklets and least auklets and parakeet auklets. And then we stop at a special spot to see thick-billed murres nesting on this pillar rock. There's also horned and tufted puffins mixed in. You have the opportunity to possibly spot some rare birds like whiskered auklet, another chance at short-tailed albatross, and mottled petrel is also possible on the return trip back to Adak. We attached a tree to the boat thinking we might get passerines that would fly in and land in it. That didn't happen. But we did see orcas.
What?
It's pretty neat to encounter some of these pelagic species up close. Albatross right near the boat. There's a least auklet. And lastly, our whiskered auklets coming up. Just target birds that people can only dream of. And so if you ever have the chance to bird Attu, I encourage that you take advantage of it, start saving, figure out a way to make it happen. And even if you get just to Adak, there's still all sorts of wonderful birds that are there in Adak for you to find. So I could talk forever about Attu. I have many more pictures, maps, stories, but I think, Nate, we're going to turn it over to some of the questions that have come in. So I'm going to pause this and let's answer some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Christian.
Yeah.
If you would drop the screen share, we'll get you back.
Yeah.
Perfect. That was amazing. So many great things there. How long do you stay on Attu on a trip like this?
Oh, that's a great question. So let's see, last year, can you see me all right on the video?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Let me navigate back to you so I can see you. So last year we went out May 22nd and stayed through June 8th. And so about 2 weeks, and that's 2.5 days about to get out there, 2.5 days to come back. So our time on Attu, and I'm consulting my calendar here, I think we were on like the 25th through the 3rd or 4th. So at least 9 or 10 days of solid birding on Attu.
Yeah. What is the elevation of the mountains? A question from Stephen McGuire.
Good question. So the tallest mountains on Attu, I think, are about 3,000 feet above sea level. I never hiked that high because those were really steep and covered in snow. And I didn't have the proper rescue gear. I didn't have crampons, ice axe, a rope, or anybody else really to go with me.
Right.
So safety prohibited me from really exploring the tallest peaks on Attu. But I ventured up to about 1,800 feet on some of the closer mountains to the Cove and did some glissading and was able to safely explore some of the lower peaks that were closer to Casco Cove.
Yeah. And how many people are on a trip like this?
I think we had, this is where someone can fact check me. I think we had about 15 or 16. Mm-hmm. The size of the trip is limited by the boat's capacity because everyone's living on the boat together. So we had 2 guides, and I think we had 12 or 14 participants. Mm-hmm. And that's a great question, though, for the tour leaders. But yeah, I think we had about 16 folks on the trip with us.
Yeah. Jennifer Toms asked, what was the temperature on that nice day?
Oh, man, it got up above 60 degrees a couple times. So it was t-shirt weather, especially when you're biking or hiking in rain gear. And the weather can change so quickly on Attu. So I had a picture that I didn't slide in the presentation of Attu covered in snow at the end of May. So it's super possible to get snow and to have below freezing temps. But on those sunny days, it warmed up to just over 60 degrees.
Wow. Yeah, it's balmy for the Aleutians.
It was beautiful.
I have a question from YouTube from Scott Flinch, who asks, inevitable gear question. What optics did you bring? What did you wish you had brought that you didn't? And favorite memory of the trips? Sure.
So optics is a good question. I had Maven binoculars. So my Maven 9x45s, just a standard binocular that is made by the company. My default kind of disclaimer is they sponsored me on my big year, so I helped kind of promote them, and they gave me optics to use. And so I had my Maven binoculars. I had my Canon 1-400 zoom lens, and on the, let's see, that was the 7D body the first year, and then I've upgraded my equipment since then, and now I've gone mirrorless. So I have a Sony A9 and the same 1-400 lens, which is great to carry around all day birding on Attu. It's nice and lightweight. You can shoot birds in flight, and it has enough reach to crop a picture and get good images. But my photos weren't comparable with the photographer that brought his 500 millimeter prime lens.
That's a lot to bring on a trip like that, it feels like.
It's heavy, and so with a lens like that, his images were a little grainier, and a lot of the days are dark, except when the weather was an anomaly. So the 7D Mark II and a 100-400 lens is a great combo to use out there.
So the $1 million question, and I mean that almost literally, ballpark price for a trip like this.
I think it's about $10,000.
Yeah.
And there's certainly ways to cut the corners. For example, I had an Alaska Airlines Visa MasterCard. So when I signed up for the credit card, I was able to earn enough bonus miles to fly to and from Adak for free. And so that definitely makes the trip cheaper. I actually checked to see what an Anchorage to Adak flight would cost me if I wanted to go next week. Mm-hmm. It was over $1,000 round trip.
I'm not surprised. Yeah. So
you can save a lot on the airfare with that. But per person, I think the prices will be on John's website. And I think those questions you can definitely direct towards him.
Yeah, John Pashuk and Zuganrua Tours. We'll give him a shout out here. So you can find it if you can spell it. What would you rate this? Roger Machik asks, what would you rate this as far as difficulty?
So difficulty, I will say it's not an easy trip, but it's not a difficult trip. I would call it a challenge by choice. And I'd say you have to be in decent physical shape, be able to ride a bike if you choose. You can also opt out of biking and walk, but you're going to take longer to get from point A to point B. The leaders were really good about being sure that we didn't push a bird, or if we found a bird, we waited for everybody to get there. So there were some folks that after biking the first 1 or 2 days said, this isn't for me. And they waited and held the bird until everyone got there. And so I would say you have to be in good enough physical shape to hike, up to 8 or 10 miles if you're wanting to stay with the group. But you can also opt out as the trip develops. Some people kind of get tired or want to stay on the boat. Some of the Steller sea eagle pictures, the one on the iPad was taken from the boat. And so the lady who stayed back that day on the boat, the eagle flew right over the boat. Yeah. And we were 2 miles away and saw it at a distance. So those were her photos that we all were drooling over, but she was in the right place at the right time. Yeah. So you can definitely opt out of some of the days. You can stay and look at wildflowers. You could sit and beachcomb. So I'd call it a challenge by choice. But if you want to be with the group and you want to be birding, I'd recommend doing a little bit of bicycle practice and some hiking before you go on the trip.
Yeah, Laura has a question on YouTube as well. Why are there so many rare species at Attu and the Aleutian Islands? She asks, is it abundant of resources? There's not a lot of resources there.
No, it's purely their proximity to Asia, to where those birds normally occur. And if the winds blow the birds off course, Attu is the first piece of land that they'll hit that technically belongs to the United States. And so birds get blown past Attu and end up on Adak or end up on St. Paul and St. George Island in the Pribilofs. So there's lots of places you can go to see these birds that get blown off course, but Attu, because of its proximity to Asia, just gets more.
Yeah. So Tyler Scott just shot a question over on Facebook. He's a serious Texas birder, but the birds that show up on Attu are not birds he would ever be likely to have seen of or heard. What preparation did you have before you went preparing for the birds that you were going to see that, are not birds that you typically find in a North American field guide?
Sure. So there's a great book. I have it on my shelf, Rare Birds of North America. And this book it's my favorite. It's just beautifully illustrated. And They show all the birds that you're likely to encounter on Attu that are a little bit rarer than the average field guide would portray. But the second edition, the version 2 of Sibley's Guide, shows birds like redwing and dusky thrush and olive-backed pipit, things that would show up on Attu. So you can study your field guide and contact the tour leaders for the trip, and they'll send you a list of the birds they've seen every year dating back the last 10 years. And so going off of that list, you can definitely learn those birds. I install a bird app for birds of East Asia and for the UK. And that way I can start to learn the call notes of some of the pipits or some of the, to see what a rustic bunting sounds like. And that way, if something flies over, I definitely on my big year in 2016 couldn't count multiple birds I encountered because I didn't know what they were.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to add them to my list retroactively after I had a educated guess as to what I encountered. And looking back, I now realize on Attu I encountered a hawfinch and a Siberian ruby throat and some faraway snipe that ended up being, I think pin-tailed snipe was one, and maybe a solitary snipe. Nobody got a definitive ID, I think, on that. So the better you know your birds, the greater your chances are of recognizing it.
Yeah, I got to go to the Pribilofs a few years ago, which is also not as sort of famous as Attu, but another really great rarity island in Western Alaska. And the guides there have like St. Paul. The guides there have like a book that they bring along that's like all the rare birds that have ever been seen there and photos of them if they have them. And like there are some, quote unquote rare birds that are also somewhat regular, like you sort of expect it with certain weather conditions.
Right.
And then of course the joy of going to places like that is finding just stuff that's like off the wall, not on those lists. Anything can happen sort of places, which is I don't know. It's weird being in a place where that can happen. There's only a few places in the ABA area where that are like that. Brad Miles asks, medical care is it available if needed? What's the safety like on Attu? And I appreciate the shout out there, Brad.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're kind of the primary level of care, the guides, and then each other. And so I was fortunate this last year to have a doctor as one of the participants on the trip, a trained physician, and we actually encountered, we got a radio call, the boat did, of a fish and wildlife employee on a different island who had a medical emergency, and we were the nearest people. So we actually diverted course on our return trip and picked up this employee, and the physician evaluated her and was able to make a game time decision that she needed to be evacuated their field camp from the island. So we're about 3 days or 2 days by plane and boat from medical care. And so we have to, the people on the trip are the primary care providers. If something serious were to happen, there is a runway on Attu. You could probably tell in the videos it's pretty decrepit, so there's moss growing on it. But if needed, a private life flight plane would be able to land on it and medevac somebody if it was a urgent, life-threatening emergency. Before the trip, I purchased medevac insurance, which was strongly recommended by the guides. And so if someone needed to be airlifted out, it would take, I think, like 24 hours at least to get help there and to be on your way back, just because it's so far from really Anchorage or Kodiak are the two hubs. And then Shemya, I guess, is closer, and that's an Air Force base.
Yeah.
But that's restricted access. So you can't just hop over to Shemya. It's the C-130 or a helicopter would have to probably fly and refuel there before they come over to Attu to pick someone up. So it's far.
Isn't it something like Anchorage and Alaska are as far away as like Anchorage and San Francisco? I'm sorry, Anchorage and Attu are as far away as like Anchorage and San Francisco, or some sort of ridiculous trivia thing.
I wrote this down because people ask me and I can't remember, but it's 1,500 miles to Anchorage.
Yeah.
From Attu. So that's, I think, from like Washington, D.C. to South Florida or something. It's a far distance. Yeah. And that's going on a commercial flight, flying high elevation at, 500 miles per hour.
Yeah.
So you don't want to get hurt out there is the how you can sum it up.
Yeah, I have a question. Greg Bodcrass on YouTube. Did you dip on any high priority target birds, or do you even have target birds in your out there? You just kind of take what you can get.
You know, on doing a big year, you can take what you can get. So there's
Yeah.
birds that you expect to see, and then there's birds that show up that you either see or you don't. And there's a handful of birds that I didn't see. There's a Eurasian hobby that I was on the wrong side of a revetment, which is a fancy term for a big pile of dirt. And the people on the other side saw the bird fly out and it disappeared, and I was on the other side, so I missed that and had to look at other people's pictures of a Eurasian hobby that I didn't see. But you know, it's just birds, and so you see things other people don't see. They might see something you don't. This last year, we had very few Asian passerines, so the brambling photo and rustic bunting photo that actually I don't think I stuck in that video. We didn't see either of those species this last year in 2019, just because the winds didn't favor blowing passerines all the way over to Attu. But we had a lot of shorebirds. We had multiple pteric sandpipers, multiple stints, both species and individuals of each species, the lesser sand plovers, which we didn't see in 2016, the last time I was there. So every year is different. It can be a great year or a mediocre year or a bad year. And a bad year compared to, you know, the heyday of Attu is still great for birders in this day and age.
Yeah. Gavin Elvine asks, what were the best birds from either trip? Best thing you've seen on Attu? Most exciting?
Most exciting. The Steller seagull comes to mind initially.
That's
as
got to
just
be up there. Yeah.
oh, wow. You know, that's kind of when I was a kid looking through the bird book and what's possible in the ABA area. I never thought I would see a Steller seagull, but loving raptors, it was like the coolest raptor. Some of the other birds, I saw far eastern curlew coming back from Attu a couple years ago on Adak, which was really neat. Yeah, some of the really good ones like dark-sided flycatcher or great spotted woodpecker. You know, there's lots of cool birds that have shown up that I haven't seen, but you just never know. So you're happy. I'm happy with what I could see. And that's what keeps you dreaming about going back is the lure of more birds.
I'm going to take one more question and then we're going to say goodnight. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments. Christian, if you have time in the next day or two, you can always come back and find the questions here and answer those questions as we get to it. But so thank you for all of those who are asking. Thanks for all of you who are sticking around. We still have a ton of people sticking around. Thanks for that.
That's great.
One more question from Stephen McGuire. Given that Attu is so distant, how are you able to get updated weather forecasts?
That's a great idea. So we print out the weather forecasts in advance, and then the boat actually has satellite internet, and so we can send and receive emails in a very limited capacity from the boat each night. And so the guides are sure to have people check the weather and email or text them the weather update. And so both of the guides usually have a pretty good idea of what the next couple of days will hold.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we are over an hour now. I just want to say thank you to everybody who has participated, asked questions, followed us along on this. If you like these sort of programs, maybe consider joining the ABA, aba.org/join. We would love to have you. And the information will that be in the outro graphic that I'm going to show you in just a little bit. And also be sure to check out the Blackbirders Week program tomorrow at 7 to 8:30. There's another one in the afternoon. I'll put the image for that in the comments here, and be sure to check that out if you can't get enough bird programming. There's a lot of great bird programming going on for you to avail yourself of. But I want to thank you, Christian, for joining us. I want to thank everybody for following along, and we will say good night, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks, Nate. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Great chatting with you.
Good night.